Hi everybody, it is the 21st of March. I'm Austin Perlmutter, and today we're going to continue this video series which describes how to protect your physical and mental health when you are stuck in quarantine for coronavirus. So looking forward to this video, we're going to be talking about sleep and how important sleep is in helping us to maintain our physical health, our mental health, and what are the tips and tricks that you can start applying today to start getting better sleep, even in this kind of period of high stress, high anxiety, and a high need to feel informed. Okay, well, in today's episode of Weathering the Storm, we're going to be talking about sleep. And again, these presentations are designed to bring you physical and mental health strategies while we're being quarantined. And I use this word a little bit loosely, but really what I mean is so many people are now being told to kind of hunker down and shelter at home to reduce the spread of the coronavirus, to flatten the curve. And it's become really important for us to know what we can do in these periods of relative isolation. Okay. So I want to go over again what these videos are for. We're going to talk about some general updates on coronavirus. We are going to talk about tools that you can use to improve your physical and mental health while you're isolating during coronavirus, but we're not doing these videos in order to provide individualized medical advice. I'm not trying to be technical here with regard to trying to make these medical interventions that are certain drug treatments specific to the individual, and I certainly don't want to replace any of the high quality advice that's coming out of these institutions like the World Health Organization or the CDC. So let's get into today. Today, as a general review of where we're at right now, China continues to report a very low number of new cases, and all of these cases are people coming in from other countries. So there are no new domestic cases of coronavirus, which is really wonderful news. However, in the rest of the world, we're seeing that the case number is continuing to rise exponentially. That is particularly relevant for people living in certain countries, including Italy, including many of the European countries in addition to that, and also the United States, where we're seeing that our rate of growth has been absolutely huge. Really what we've seen is that in the United States, we've had a 700% plus increase in new diagnoses in the last week. We're also seeing, and really the reason we're doing these videos, that there are increasing restrictions on leaving home. So in the United States, we've seen that news stories like this one from CNN have been coming out telling us that 75 million Americans are now told to stay home because coronavirus cases continue to go up. So in a variety of different states, people are told basically stay home unless it's absolutely necessary that you venture outside. So we are going to continue to see these types of measures, and it would not be surprising if most states started enacting similar restrictions in the coming weeks. To go over what we talked about yesterday, which are the essential actions that basically everyone needs to keep in mind, we want to reduce physical contact with other people. This is the idea of social distancing. It just means to keep space. We want to minimize exposure to non-human vectors, which means don't touch stuff that might have the virus on it. So if you're out and about and other people might have touched things, try to avoid contact with those things. And then finally, we want to try to avoid infecting ourselves with the virus. So this is why it's so important that if you think your hands might be dirty, that you wash your hands, that you're constantly being vigilant so that you don't touch your face and inoculate yourself by putting the virus into your nose or mouth. All right. The big topics that we're addressing in these videos are these topics that were coming from a recent Lancet publication that talks about what happens when people are in quarantine. So yesterday we talked about how people who are in quarantine can have an increased sense of detachment and how this stems from these social distancing type procedures, but that it's really not something that we have to avoid social connection. We just need to do it in a more physically removed way. We're also going to talk about these other factors that are a big problem in people who are experiencing quarantine. So these include insomnia, poor concentration, emotional exhaustion, poor mood, anxiety, boredom, and stigma. And what we really want to focus on for today is going to be the sleep aspect. So yesterday we talked about social connection during social distancing. Today we're talking about why sleeping is so key during quarantine. So let's go to an article that was published in Nature Reviews, and this is called Sleep and Inflammation Partners in Sickness and in Health. This is published specifically in the Immunology Nature Reviews. And why is this so important? Well, to tether this to what's going on in the world right now, as they describe in this paper, or as the author describes in this paper, one of the ways that sleep is proposed to provide a survival advantage is supporting a neurally integrated immune system that might anticipate injury and infectious threats. So getting enough sleep is helping our body to basically be ready for infectious threats. This author also says that chronic social threats can drive the development of sleep disturbances in humans, which can contribute to the dysregulation of inflammatory and antiviral responses. So why is this so relevant? I mean, this is basically exactly what we're seeing right now. We have a lot of what is perceived as social threat, a lot of stress going on right now, and that causes people to have sleep disturbances. And when people have sleep disturbances, it dysregulates inflammation and it dysregulates our antiviral response. So you can see how we face this threat, which is this stress that comes from this coronavirus spread. Not necessarily the virus itself, but that stress can lead to poor sleep, and poor sleep may actually make us more susceptible to not being able to manage the virus. As a general note here, when we're talking about insomnia, which, as I said before, is one of the key things that has been identified as a factor in quarantine, at baseline, insomnia is affecting about 25% of Americans. It increases the risk for depression. It increases the risk for infectious diseases. So imagine now where we have a situation where so many people are having issues with their sleep on top of this 25% that already existed. You can see that we have a significant problem. What exactly are the big functions of sleep that we care about, and why is that relevant for this conversation? Well, sleep improves our decision making. Now, as it relates to these challenging times, being able to make good decisions is more imperative than ever. It also regulates the HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which enables us to calm down stress. It regulates the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of that stress response and activates the fight or flight response. And we'll talk about why that's relevant in a little while. Sleep helps regulate the immune system, as mentioned, and again, regulates mood. Another thing that most people don't know about sleep is that it's actually helpful in allowing us to regulate our emotional reactivity. When we get enough sleep, we're not as reactive towards other people. So that is key if you think about the fact that now all of us, well, many of us, I should say, are living in close quarters with family and friends, or significant others, and it becomes really key that we're able to regulate our emotional responses to maintain some level of calm in these environments. Now, there's also some really fascinating antiviral functions of sleep. It supports the adaptive immune response, which is absolutely essential in enabling us to fight off these viruses. And it also is shown to increase these antiviral cytokines, things like interferons and interleukin 12, which help to tell our body now's the time to prepare the antiviral response so that we can fight off these bugs. Okay, let's now talk a little bit about sleep and stress. So in this paper, they talk about how sleep and stress interact bidirectionally. Prior stress can impair sleep, and alterations in sleep can change stress hormone levels. Now, you probably understand already that when you're stressed, it's hard to go to sleep. But now we have this kind of newer threat to our stress response system, which is we are being inundated with stressful data. And I totally understand the need to stay informed. But when this goes from being informed to activating our stress and HPA system 24/7, that then is going to lead to lower quality of sleep. All right, so let's try to be a little bit more pragmatic as to what we can do to start improving our sleep during this pandemic, because that's really the key takeaway. It's fine to talk about why sleep is so important, but unless we can actually gain from this information, it doesn't really matter. So what we're going to talk about in this video is how to create a sleep schedule, how to create a pre-sleep routine, how to limit exposure to stressful material before bed, how to limit exposure to blue light before bed. And when you combine these things, in addition to a couple other factors we'll mention towards the end of this video, you should be well on your way to reclaiming a good night's sleep, despite the fact that there's so much going on. So let's start with creating a sleep schedule. It's clear that the coronavirus has altered most of our schedules and our responsibilities. There are so many people who are used to going to work 5 days a week who are now either trying to find themselves working from home or maybe not working for the moment. Our responsibilities are obviously different if we're not at our jobs, if we're now looking after our kids who might have been in school or in daycare. So things are different. And this changes our sleep schedule because now it's potentially easier to stay up late, to watch TV, to watch movies, to hang out with whoever's at our homes, and also to sleep in late. If we're not obligated to get up early for work, it's kind of easy to press that snooze button. So what we want to be doing in order to create a new sleep schedule is to create a new bedtime. And this might seem like something that isn't super fun at first, but it's so helpful. So it's trying to pick a time that is going to be functional for you and for whoever else you're living with, such that everyone can get on the same page and such that everybody can be getting that 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. Now, that bedtime may not be the same as what you were doing before all of this started. The key is just to find something that is agreeable to you, and if you are living with other people, that can work with their schedules as well. This is also an important point here. So we all know about setting an alarm to wake up in the morning. It's how we get out of bed, and it actually can be helpful to get us to reset to a new schedule. But setting a sleep alarm is something that not many people do. I find it to be a really helpful reminder when it's easy to get caught up in, let's say, a Netflix queue or something like that, to remind you that, okay, now it's 10 o'clock, now it's time to go to bed, so that you don't find yourself throwing off your routine. And as I generally say in these types of instances, I think iterating and testing so that you find what actually works for you, given that there are a lot of variables, is really key. Finally, this is a challenging time. You don't want to be too hard on yourself if you go 30 minutes, an hour over your new sleep schedule. We're talking about potentially weeks to months here, so it's really key that you give yourself some slack, but keep working on trying to find what actually is most functional. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about creating a sleep routine. Some of the most important points to consider when you're designing your routine around sleep are figuring out when you want to be shutting off the news and getting updates. There is so much information coming out right now. You can check your computer 5 times a day, 20 times a day, 100 times a day, and you're always going to find a little bit more information as to what's going on with the coronavirus. But if you find yourself stressed at the end of the day, if you find yourself struggling to get to sleep, maybe it's worthwhile to ask how much that extra data is really helping you. So it might be worthwhile to think about maybe not looking at the news for an hour before bed or 2 hours before bed, because practically speaking, it's not going to change too much that you do, and it might lead to a higher quality of sleep. Another really big factor here is to decide when you are going to stop drinking caffeine. Now, caffeine has a half-life around 6 or so hours, which means that if you're drinking caffeine well into the afternoon, that's very likely going to contribute to a lower quality of sleep for you. I generally recommend that people stop drinking caffeine at around 2 p.m. as a starting point, and if they're still having trouble sleeping, I would just bump that back by about 2 hours to around noon. So it's really, I'm not somebody saying that you shouldn't drink coffee. I'm a big fan of coffee. I'm a big fan of caffeine in general, but the goal here is to enjoy caffeine, but not to let it compromise your sleep. You also want to think about when you are going to have non-digital time before bed. And given that we're all in our homes right now, our phones are readily available, it's tempting to be on our phones right before we go to sleep and right when we wake up. Actually, data from before the coronavirus came out show that the average American, actually 80-ish% of Americans, reach for their phones in the first 15 minutes before waking up. And so people on the other end are actually reaching for their phones right before they go to sleep, or I should say, are on their phones right before they go to sleep. Studies have found, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that when we're exposed to blue light before bed, and one of the places that comes from is through our cell phone screens, that can throw off our sleeping patterns, in addition to the stress that can come from looking at social media or the news on our phones or other screens before bed. So think about maybe reading or just setting aside time for an hour or so before bed. That can help you to create a better routine. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about how to limit exposure to stress before bed. This is definitely something that I am still working on. One of the things that comes up a lot in this period of uncertainty is conversations about what to do next. Do you need to go out and buy more food? Do you need to try to be helping your neighbor? Do you need to be reaching out to your friends and family? Do you need to be learning something new? There are a whole lot of difficult conversations right now. And with that said, I think there are better times to be having those more challenging conversations because as it relates to increasing levels of stress, what we know is that our cortisol levels or our stress hormone levels in general should be going down as we get to bed and kind of hitting their lowest point in the night at around midnight. So what we don't want to do is stimulate that level of cortisol to go up right before bed. And so maybe it's worthwhile if you have a partner or somebody else living in the house where you're living, that you have a conversation about what are the appropriate topics to be discussing in the hour or so before bed. The next thing to talk about here is, as we mentioned before, news and digital exposure tends to be something that is high stress in general, and especially right now. So limiting that is going to be helpful in cutting back on the stress activating content that tends to be so prevalent in these sources. You also want to think about what you can do to calm the mind. And why do we talk so much about these relaxation techniques as it relates to the end of the day? It's because this helps to get you into the right state to be able to drift off into sleep. And I'm not saying that it has to be anything as significant as what this picture seems to imply, but a hot shower can be really helpful. A hot bath does wonderful things. A quick meditation, 5 to 10 minute meditation, or just paying attention to your breath for a few minutes. Even reading a kind of low-key, mellow book, or having a mellow conversation with somebody who you care about to check in and just say how much you care about them. Doing some gratitude practice. There are a whole lot of different things that we can be doing, but the goal is to try to get your mind into a state where it's able to fall asleep. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here in this series is that we want to limit our exposure to blue light before bed. I mentioned this earlier, but as it turns out, when we're using these digital devices, they are throwing off a lot of blue light. That isn't necessarily problematic overall, but as it relates to our sleep patterns, it turns out that blue light exposure appears to block the production of melatonin and appears to inhibit our ability to get a good night's sleep. So really key here to think about limiting your exposure to blue light emitting devices, basically any digital device, before bed. There are, however, some ways to get around this if you feel a strong need to be using these devices before bed. One of the ways of doing this is to use blue light blocking lenses. You can buy these kind of sunglassy looking things online. They're very cheap. And the other big thing is to use or engage things like night mode on your device, which tends to change the colors of the light that is getting through to offset some of that increased blue light and, in essence, to minimize the blue light exposure that you would be getting before bed. Okay, so at this point, I want to talk about a couple more things that you can do when you're having trouble getting sleep, because a lot of you might be thinking, okay, I've been doing this stuff, but it's still not working. One of the things that can be easy to do when you don't have a schedule is to take naps during the daytime. These are delightful. Trust me, I enjoy these very much, but when you're taking a daytime nap, it can throw off your circadian rhythms. So if you are struggling to get and stay asleep, it's probably worth considering cutting out your daytime naps. The other thing is, as I mentioned, caffeine. You want to make sure that you're not drinking caffeine too close to bedtime. And then lack of movement. It turns out that exercising can help us to get a good night's sleep. It's challenging given that gyms are closed and that our schedules are all up in the air to put in a set period for movement. But this doesn't have to be a tremendous ultra marathon training. I've been doing a lot of just basic circuits around my house and trying to just get my body moving to some degree. So if you're still struggling to sleep despite everything we've talked about, you might consider just doing some basic movement exercise around your house. It can even be as basic as some yoga, some stretching, just something to get your body in motion. Lastly, temperature. Turns out that our bodies do better in falling to sleep if they are at a little bit of a lower temperature. So if you Generally sleep at a temperature that's above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe now's a good time to drop that somewhere between the low to mid 60s and see how that goes for you. Okay, so that's today's presentation. As before, you can connect with me, you can comment on this video, or you can find me on Instagram. Happy to answer any questions that people have and to engage in conversations with you guys. Okay, everybody. Well, I hope that was helpful for you. Again, the take-home message is that our sleep schedules are going to get thrown off with all of the new stuff going on as far as changes to our schedules, changes to our stress levels, changes to our day-to-day obligations. But we really need to prioritize as much as we can getting a 7 to 8 hour window of sleep each night, because that's going to be so key in enabling us to optimize our physical health and our mental health in these challenging times. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you soon.